She married the Duke by letter. The moment she met him, she regretted everything. Some women spend years searching for the perfect husband. Lady Rachel Vance did the unthinkable. She married a man she'd never seen. Not for love. Not for money. And certainly not for romance. She wanted a quiet life, a distant husband, and a marriage that existed only on paper. It sounded like the perfect arrangement. Until the day she finally arrived at her new home and discovered the truth. Because the man she had mistaken for a stable hand was the Duke she'd just married. And from that moment on, nothing went the way either of them expected. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories where pain shatters and true character shines through. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and your presence makes these stories come alive. Want even more unforgettable love stories? Join our members community and enjoy exclusive content made just for you. 1. Most brides meet their husbands before the wedding. Lady Rachel Vance met hers after. She was 31 years old, unmarried, and completely done with being told that this was a tragedy. Her mother called her a spinster in a soft, pitying voice, as though the word might hurt less if she whispered it. Her father simply sighed and mentioned another baron. This one was 72, owned 4 hunting dogs, and had gout in both feet. Rachel had said no to 11 men in 9 years. She was sharp, and she knew it. She read faster than her brothers, argued better than her father, and had opinions on things unmarried ladies were not supposed to have opinions on, like land taxes and bad poetry, and why every romantic novel she had ever read ended the moment things became interesting. Most men found her exhausting. She found most men boring. It was, she believed, a fair trade. She had made peace with being alone. She had a townhouse of her own money, a library that took up 2 full rooms, and a habit of reading until the candles burned down to nothing. She did not need a husband to be happy. She only needed people to stop asking her when she planned to become one. Then the letter came. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday, sealed with a wax stamp shaped like a wolf. It was from a solicitor representing a duke in the north of England, a man named Arthur Sterling, who needed a wife by a certain date or he would lose his family's estate to a greedy cousin. The letter did not ask for love. It did not ask for beauty. It asked only for a signature, a marriage by proxy, and a promise that the new Duchess would live quietly and ask for nothing in return. Rachel read it twice. Then she asked her father for a pen. "You cannot be serious," her mother said, reading over her shoulder. "You have never even met the man. You do not know his face. You do not know his temper. You do not even know if he has all his teeth." "That," Rachel said, "is exactly why I am signing it." She pictured her future clearly, the way she pictured everything, in neat and orderly lines. A cold, distant husband who lived somewhere else entirely. A separate wing of some drafty old castle. Long days of reading by the fire with no one to bother her about hunting dogs or gout or when she planned to produce an heir. A title, without the trouble of a man attached to it. It sounded, frankly, like heaven. He might be old, her father warned. He might be cruel. He might be neither, Rachel said. And even if he is, I shall simply never see him. That is the entire arrangement, father. That is why I am signing. 2 weeks later, the papers were signed, sealed, and sent north. Lady Rachel Vance became, on paper, the Duchess of Oakhaven. She had never laid eyes on her husband. She had exchanged exactly 4 letters with him through his solicitor, brief and businesslike, discussing arrangements and dates and nothing at all of substance. She did not particularly care to know more. She packed her trunks with her favorite books, her writing desk, and enough dresses to last a quiet winter, and she told her maid there was no need to come along. She wanted, above all things, to be left entirely alone. The journey to Yorkshire took 4 days. The roads grew rougher with every mile, and the hills grew wilder, until the carriage finally rattled up a long gravel drive toward a manor house that looked like it had been built by giants and then forgotten by everyone else. Oakhaven Manor was enormous, grey, and slightly crooked, as if the whole building had shrugged once and never quite recovered. Ivy climbed one entire wing. A chimney leaned at a worrying angle. It was, Rachel thought, exactly the sort of house a reclusive, ancient duke would own. She stepped down from the carriage, smoothed her traveling dress, and prepared to meet whatever elderly, humorless man waited inside to ignore her for the rest of their natural lives. Instead, she found chaos. There was mud everywhere. There was a broken cart wheel leaning against the front steps. There was a chicken running in frantic circles around a fountain that did not appear to have worked in decades, its stone basin choked with leaves. And in the middle of it all, standing in the courtyard with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and soot smeared across one cheek, was a man wrestling with a goat. Not arguing with a goat in the poetic sense. Actually wrestling it. The goat had its horns locked around a length of rope, and the man had both hands on the other end, and neither of them looked like they were winning. "Let go," the man growled at the goat. "I built you a perfectly good pen. There is hay in that pen. There is shelter in that pen. Why must you insist on the vegetable garden?" The goat did not let go. Rachel stood by the carriage, trunk in hand, and stared. The man was tall, broad through the shoulders, and covered head to boot in dirt and soot, as though he had spent the morning crawling through a chimney rather than managing an estate. His dark hair stuck up in 3 directions, clearly the result of running frustrated hands through it more than once. His shirt had lost a button somewhere in the struggle, and a triangle of tanned skin showed at his throat. He looked, she thought, exactly like a man who worked in a stable, and not at all like a man who owned one, though despite his chaotic state, he was undeniably one of the most handsome men she had ever seen. "You there," she called, striding forward, her boots already sinking slightly into the mud. "I need someone to take my boots. They're ruined from the road." The man turned. His eyes, she noticed even from a distance, were a startling grey, like storm clouds right before the rain starts. "Your boots," he repeated, still holding the rope with one hand, the goat straining against him. "Yes. And my trunks. And someone competent to tell the housekeeper that the new Duchess has arrived, and that she would very much like a hot bath and a cup of tea that has not been shaken half to death on a Yorkshire road." She bent, unlaced one boot, and held it out to him, mud and all, as though he might simply take it and vanish. The man looked at the boot. Then he looked at her fine travelling dress and her carefully pinned hair and her expression that expected to be obeyed. Something flickered behind those grey eyes, something that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of a laugh he was trying very hard to hold back. It only made him impossibly more attractive. "You're the new housekeeper, I take it," he said. "Come to inspect the grounds before Her Grace arrives, and to warn the staff about the state of the fountain." Rachel blinked. "I beg your pardon. I was told the new Duchess would be arriving today. I assumed the agency sent someone ahead to prepare the house. Though I confess," he said, wiping a hand across his soot-streaked jaw, only making it worse, "I did not expect the housekeeper to hand me her boots on sight, nor to speak to me as though I were the one who ought to be taking orders." Understanding landed on Rachel like a bucket of cold water. "You think I am the housekeeper," she said slowly. "Are you not?" "I most certainly am not." The goat chose that moment to headbutt the man squarely in the stomach, and he staggered back with a grunt, finally losing his grip on the rope entirely. The goat trotted off victoriously toward the vegetable garden, tail flicking, as though it had planned this all along. The man straightened, brushed himself off with little success, and looked at Rachel with new and dawning suspicion. "Then who," he said carefully, "are you?" "I am Rachel Vance." She lifted her chin, still holding out the muddy boot, though rather less confidently now. "The new Duchess of this household." The silence that followed was, in Rachel's opinion, extremely satisfying. The man's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. He looked down at himself, at the mud and the soot and the missing button and the general ruin of his appearance, and then back up at her perfectly composed travelling dress and her perfectly composed face, and something like horror crossed his features. "You are Lady Rachel," he said, as if testing the words. "The Duchess of Oakhaven, apparently, though I have yet to see any evidence of a duchy worth the title, and I have been standing in mud for a full 3 minutes now. I am Arthur Sterling." He said it like an apology, and gave a short, awkward bow that ended halfway, as if he had only just remembered his manners and was not entirely sure they still applied to him. "The Duke of Oakhaven." Rachel looked him over once, slowly, from his ruined boots to his soot-covered face, and felt the entire fantasy of her quiet, peaceful, husband-free future crumble into the mud at her feet. You, she said, are supposed to be old. You, he said, and here, infuriatingly, a smile began to tug at the corner of his mouth, are supposed to have sent your boots to an actual servant, and not to the man you signed your name to 3 weeks ago. I thought you were a stable hand. I thought you were the housekeeper. This is a disaster. It is, he agreed cheerfully, taking the boot from her hand at last, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment longer than necessary, though I should mention, as your husband, I generally prefer a warmer greeting than being handed someone's dirty boots and mistaken for hired help in my own courtyard. Rachel stared at him. He was not old. He was not cold. He was not, in fact, anything she had planned for. He was 30-some years of trouble wrapped in an aristocratic title, standing in a mud puddle with a missing button and a smile that promised her peaceful, quiet future was never, ever going to happen. She had wanted a ghost for a husband. Instead, she had married chaos itself, and chaos was currently grinning at her like it already knew it had one. I regret this, she announced, entirely. Give it a week, Arthur said, tucking her single muddy boot under his arm with the casual air of a man who had decided, quite suddenly, that this was the most entertaining morning he'd had in months. You might regret it slightly less. I doubt that very much. You haven't even seen the library yet. I have a feeling you'll forgive me a great deal once you've seen the library. Behind them, the goat let out a triumphant bleat from somewhere deep in the cabbage patch. A footman finally appeared, wide-eyed, to collect her trunks, and a stout, flustered woman in an apron came hurrying from the house, wringing her hands and apologizing for the state of the front drive, the goat, and the Duke himself, in that order. Rachel decided, right then, standing in the mud with one bare foot and a husband who had mistaken her for a servant within the first minute of meeting her, that Oakhaven Manor was going to be the longest, strangest chapter of her entire life. She had no idea, yet, how right she was. 2. Breakfast at Oakhaven Manor was, Rachel discovered on her very first morning as its Duchess, a battlefield disguised as a meal. The cook, a nervous woman named Mrs. Pruitt, had confused the salt with the sugar, so the tea tasted like the sea and the porridge tasted like nothing at all, and the toast had been buttered with something that was very possibly candle wax. Arthur ate his ruined breakfast without complaint, as though this happened often enough that he no longer noticed. Rachel noticed immediately, took one sip of the tea, and set the cup down with a small, decisive clink. Does your kitchen always attempt to poison its guests? She asked. Only the new ones, Arthur said, not looking up from his newspaper. It's a tradition. Builds character. I did not marry into a house of comedians. No, he agreed, buttering another piece of the wax-flavored toast without any apparent concern. You married into a house of chaos. I believe we discussed this yesterday, in the mud, over a goat, while you stood on the front step with one boot missing. Rachel set down her spoon. If she was going to survive this marriage, she decided, they needed rules. Boundaries. A clear map of where he ended and her piece began, drawn in ink if necessary. We need an arrangement, she said. Arthur looked up, one eyebrow raised. I thought we had one. It's called a marriage contract. You signed it. I have it somewhere, though I confess I misplaced it under a pile of estate ledgers sometime last month. A better arrangement. Rules of the house. He considered this, then nodded slowly, as if she had proposed something reasonable rather than something slightly ridiculous. Go on, then. I'm listening. I do enjoy a good set of rules. Mostly because I so rarely follow them. They moved the discussion to the library, which was, Rachel admitted privately, the only room in the manor that did not appear to be actively falling apart. Tall windows let in grey northern light. Shelves rose 2 stories high, packed with books that smelled of leather and dust, and a rolling ladder stood ready against one wall. For the first time since arriving, Rachel felt something close to hope. With great ceremony, she found a length of ribbon in a drawer and laid it across the center of the rug, dividing the room neatly into 2 halves. This side is mine, she said, gesturing to the side with the good armchair and the better light. You may enter it only when invited. And this side, Arthur said, gesturing to his half, which held a large table covered in rolled-up estate blueprints, half-finished sketches, and at least one teacup that had clearly been forgotten for several days, is apparently mine, though I don't recall inviting you to draw a line through my library, Duchess. I promise not to interfere with your work, Rachel said. You promise not to interfere with my freedom. I read when I please. I walk when I please. I do not attend social calls unless I choose to. And you do not ask me to behave like a wife who has any interest in you whatsoever. Agreed, on all counts. He held out his hand. She shook it, once, firmly, the way she might shake hands with a business partner closing a deal, and told herself the small, odd flutter in her chest was simply relief. It was, she thought, a very sensible arrangement. It lasted almost 4 hours. The trouble began when Arthur removed his coat to work on his blueprints, muttering about a collapsing wall in the east wing that needed shoring up before winter. Then he removed his waistcoat, tossing it carelessly over the back of a chair. By mid-afternoon he was in nothing but his shirt sleeves, bent over the table with his forearms braced against the wood, muttering calculations under his breath, sunlight catching the dust motes around him, and Rachel found it shockingly difficult to keep her eyes on her book. She was reading the same sentence for the 5th time, having absorbed none of it, when the knock came at the front door. It was not a servant's knock. It was the confident, entitled knock of someone who expected the door to open immediately. Arthur straightened, glanced out the window, and went pale. That, he said, is the vicar. And his wife. So they have been trying to inspect my new bride for a week, and I have been avoiding them with increasing creativity, and if they discover that we have drawn a ribbon down the middle of the library and shake hands like business partners, the entire county will know within the hour that the Duke's marriage is a sham arranged purely to save an inheritance. Rachel's stomach dropped. It is a sham. They cannot know that. Arthur crossed the room in 3 strides and, before she could protest, pulled her up out of her chair. Quickly. We need to look married. We are married. We need to look like we like it. The vicar, a round, cheerful man named Mr. Cobb, and his wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Cobb who missed absolutely nothing, were shown into the library moments later. Rachel found herself standing far too close to her husband, his arm around her waist, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress in a way that made her entirely forget the sentence she had failed 5 times to read. Your Grace, Mrs. Cobb said, eyes sweeping the room, lingering suspiciously on the ribbon still lying across the rug, we simply had to come and meet the new Duchess. Such a surprise, a marriage by letter. So unusual. So very fast. So romantic, Arthur said smoothly, and squeezed Rachel's waist. Then, dropping his voice to a whisper only she could hear, he added, smile. You look like you're planning my murder. I am planning your murder, Rachel whispered back, smiling brightly at Mrs. Cobb. Slowly. With that ribbon. Later, then. Right now, laugh, as if I've said something charming. Rachel laughed. It came out a little too loud, a little too sharp, but Mrs. Cobb seemed satisfied enough, and stepped further into the room, eyeing the abandoned ribbon with open curiosity. What an interesting decoration, she said. Is that ribbon meant to mark something? A game, Arthur said instantly. Rachel is teaching me to walk a straight line. I have a habit of wandering when I read. It's a terrible habit. Drives her mad. How lovely, Mrs. Cobb said, though her eyes remained narrow with lingering suspicion, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to press further. We fell in love through letters, Arthur announced, turning Rachel gently to face him, his grey eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch despite herself. Her words were so clever, Mrs. Cobb, I couldn't help myself. I had to marry her before some other man discovered how brilliant she was and snatched her up before I ever had the chance. How very lovely indeed, Mrs. Cobb said, softening slightly despite herself. Isn't it, Arthur murmured, close enough now that Rachel could feel his breath against her ear. Now put your hand on my chest. Married women do that. I've seen it. In paintings, mostly, but I'm told it happens in real life too. I have never in my life seen a married woman do that outside a painting. Do it anyway. She did it anyway, mostly to make him stop talking, and the moment her palm pressed flat against his chest, she felt his heart beating fast beneath her fingers. Too fast for a man simply performing for guests. She looked up at him, startled, and found him looking back at her with an expression that was no longer performing anything at all. For one strange, breathless second, neither of them moved. Well, Mrs. Cobb said brightly, breaking the spell, I can see this was a foolish worry on my part. You two are clearly devoted. Devoted, Arthur repeated, still looking at Rachel. Yes. The vicar and his wife did not stay long after that, satisfied that the scandal they had come hunting for did not exist, though Mrs. Cobb cast one last curious glance at the ribbon on her way out the door. The moment it closed behind them, Arthur stepped back from Rachel so quickly he nearly knocked over a side table, sending a small porcelain shepherdess wobbling precariously before he caught it. "Well," he said, straightening his shirt, his voice slightly rough. "That worked." "Yes," Rachel said, her hand still tingling where it had rested against his chest. "It did." Neither of them mentioned the ribbon on the floor, which Arthur had accidentally stepped over twice during their performance and never once noticed, and which Rachel, later that evening, quietly folded up and put away in a drawer, no longer entirely sure she wanted a line drawn between them at all. That night, alone in her room, Rachel lay awake and stared at the ceiling, furious with herself. She had not wanted a husband who made her heart race. She had wanted quiet. She had wanted peace. She had wanted, more than anything, to be left entirely alone, with her books and her freedom and no man's opinion to consider. Instead, she kept thinking about grey eyes, and a fast heartbeat under her palm, and a whisper against her ear that had nothing to do with the vicar at all. She realized with growing dread, in a great deal of trouble. 3. The county assembly ball took place 3 weeks later, in a grand hall lit by more candles than Rachel had ever seen in one room, their light bouncing off polished floors and the jewels of half the county's gentry. She wore deep blue silk, her hair pinned high with a single strand of pearls, and she walked in on Arthur's arm feeling, for the first time since arriving in Yorkshire, like a proper duchess. He had scrubbed the soot from his face and dressed in a coat that actually fit him, and she found, treacherously, that she could not stop glancing at him. That feeling of triumph lasted exactly 11 minutes. "Well, well." The voice belonged to a thin, sharp-faced man who appeared at Rachel's elbow like a bad smell, his smile all teeth and no warmth. The famous mail-order bride, in the flesh at last. "Cousin Reginald," Arthur said, his voice flat as a closed door. "I did wonder when you'd slither in. I hoped it might be later rather than sooner, but I suppose hope is a luxury I rarely afford myself where you're concerned." Reginald ignored him, focused entirely on Rachel with a cold, assessing smile that travelled from her slippers to her pearls and back again. "Tell me, Lady Rachel, was it desperation that drove you to marry a man you'd never met? Or simply that no one else in London would have you, and a duke by letter was the best offer left on the table?" The room around them had gone quiet in that particular way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. Rachel felt her face grow hot, felt 11 years of careful, sharp-tongued composure gathering in her chest, ready to strike back with something devastating enough to end Reginald's evening entirely. But Arthur moved first. He stepped between them, not violently, but with a quiet, absolute authority that made Reginald take an involuntary step backward, his sneer faltering for just a moment. "I courted my wife through letters," Arthur said, his voice pleasant, almost gentle, though his eyes had gone hard as flint, because her mind was worth more than every simpering conversation in every ballroom in London combined. "I did not need to see her face to know I wanted her. I only needed to read one page of her handwriting, one single clever, cutting sentence, to understand that she was the most brilliant woman I would ever meet, and that I would be a fool to let some London gentleman with more title than sense claim her first." The room, which had gone quiet for scandal, now went quiet for something else entirely. "She terrified you," Reginald said weakly, trying to recover some ground. "That's what this is. You were too much of a coward to court a woman properly, so you hid behind paper and ink. She terrifies everyone with half a brain," Arthur said. "You, apparently, have never had the pleasure of a conversation with a woman who could outthink you in under a minute. I recommend you try it sometime, cousin. It's humbling. It might even improve you, though I confess I have my doubts." Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp and delighted, and Reginald, red-faced and thoroughly beaten, retreated into the safety of the punch table, muttering something no one bothered to listen to. Arthur turned to Rachel, held out his hand, and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Dance with me, Duchess." There was, unfortunately, one small problem. Neither of them knew the regional waltz currently being struck up by the county's small but enthusiastic orchestra. "You do know how to dance," Rachel whispered as he led her onto the floor, other couples already forming lines around them. "I know how to dance in London," Arthur whispered back. This is a different waltz entirely. Some Yorkshire invention. I have no idea what my feet are meant to be doing, and I suspect we are about to find out together. That is an extremely poor time to tell me, given that the entire county is currently staring at us. Would you have preferred I let Reginald keep talking instead? He pulled her into the first step, and immediately stepped on her toe. She hissed, stepped back, and stepped on his in return, purely out of spite. What followed was, by any reasonable standard, a disaster. They turned the wrong direction twice, colliding gently with the couple beside them. Arthur nearly dropped her during a spin that was meant to be graceful and instead resembled a near catastrophe. Rachel elbowed him in the ribs, trying to correct his grip on her waist. "You are the worst dancer I have ever partnered," she whispered furiously, even as she found herself fighting back a laugh that threatened to ruin her dignified composure entirely. "You are hardly better. I am used to partners who know the steps." "Then perhaps," Arthur said, spinning her again, catching her against his chest when she stumbled over her own hem, "you should have married one of your gout-ridden barons instead. I imagine they at least knew this dance, having attended every ball in Yorkshire since before I was born. Perhaps I should have. Do you regret it?" His voice had changed, gone quieter, more serious, even as his feet continued to fumble gamely through the dance around them. "Marrying me?" Rachel looked up at him. From the balcony above, from the crowd around them, it must have looked like the most passionate dance in Yorkshire history, two people gazing into each other's eyes, moving as one, utterly absorbed in one another. In truth, they were two terrible dancers, breathless from stepping on each other's feet, having the most honest conversation of their entire marriage in the middle of a crowded ballroom. "Ask me again later," she said. "Why later?" "Because right now," she admitted, quietly enough that only he could hear over the music, "I am having a great deal of trouble remembering why I ever wanted a husband who would leave me alone." Something shifted in his expression, something warm and startled and pleased all at once, chasing away the last of the tension Reginald had left behind. He spun her one final time, and though his feet still did not know the steps, for a moment neither of them cared at all who was watching, or what the county would say the next morning over their breakfast tables. Across the room, Reginald watched with a face like curdled milk, his earlier confidence entirely drained away. Mrs. Cobb watched with the deeply satisfied expression of a woman who had already decided, correctly this time, that there was a real romance blooming under her nose, ribbon or no ribbon. And Rachel, spinning in the arms of a man she had married sight unseen, felt something dangerous and wonderful take root in her chest, something she had spent 11 years carefully avoiding. It was starting to feel, terrifyingly, like she might be falling in love with her own husband. 4. The storm hit Oak Haven 3 nights later, and it hit hard. Rain hammered the roof for hours, and the wind screamed through the old chimneys like something alive. Somewhere around midnight, the ceiling above Rachel's bed gave a long, groaning creak and began to leak in earnest, a fat, cold drop landing squarely on her pillow. She grabbed her dressing gown and a candle and fled the room before the whole thing came down on her head entirely, padding barefoot down the dark, drafty corridor in search of somewhere dry. The only dry room left in that wing of the house, she discovered, was Arthur's study. She found him there, awake, in his shirt sleeves, a glass of scotch untouched on the desk beside him, firelight flickering across his tired face. Spread out in front of him were dozens of letters, tied loosely with string, the paper soft and worn from handling. She recognized her own handwriting on several of them, the ink slightly faded now. "Roof's leaking," she said, by way of explanation, standing awkwardly in the doorway with her candle throwing long shadows up the walls. "It does that," Arthur said, not looking entirely surprised. "Every storm, without fail. I've meant to fix it for 2 years now. I keep meaning to fix a great many things." He looked up, and something in his face, tired and open in a way she hadn't seen before, made her step further into the room instead of turning back toward the cold, wet corridor. "Sit. It's dry here, at least. The fire's still going." She sat across from him, near the fire, and glanced at the letters scattered between them. "You kept them. All of them. All of them." He picked one up, turned it over gently in his hands, as though it was something fragile. "I read your first letter 40 times before I answered it. I told myself I was being cautious, weighing my words carefully before I committed to anything. Really, I just liked your handwriting. And your terrible opinions about hunting, which you expressed at considerable and unnecessary length. They are not terrible opinions. They are very terrible opinions, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting, and I loved reading every single one of them. I looked forward to your letters more than I have looked forward to almost anything in my life. Thunder rolled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. The fire popped and cracked, throwing warm light across the room. Rachel found herself pulling her dressing gown tighter, not from cold, but from the strange, exposed feeling of watching Arthur look so unguarded, so far from the man who wrestled goats and grinned his way through disasters. "Why did you really marry by letter?" she asked. "You could have gone to London. Found a bride the normal way, through balls and calling cards and all the rest of it." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I hate London," he said finally. "I hate ballrooms, and matchmaking mothers who look at me and see only a title and an income, and men who judge me by my rank instead of my mind, the way half of London always has. I wanted a wife who would choose my words before she ever saw my face, before she knew what she was agreeing to beyond the words themselves. I wanted to know, for once in my life, that someone wanted me, and not simply the dukedom attached to my name. And when I arrived..." He gave a short, humorless laugh, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "When you arrived, looking like every polished, brilliant lady I'd spent my whole life feeling too rough for, too unpolished and too loud and too covered in mud, I panicked entirely. I thought, she is going to take one look at this falling down house and this soot-covered fool who can't even control a single goat, and she is going to regret every clever word she ever wrote to a man she'd never even met. I did regret it," Rachel admitted softly, watching the fire rather than his face. "For about a day. Only a day. Maybe two, if I am being entirely honest with you." He laughed again, real this time, warm and low, and the sound of it settled into her chest more comfortably than the fire ever could. There was a blanket folded over the back of his chair, and he reached for it, wrapping it around both their shoulders as she moved, almost without deciding to sit beside him on the small settee near the hearth. It was, she told herself, a practical thing, sharing warmth against the storm outside. It did not feel practical at all. "I was stubborn," Rachel said, staring into the flames rather than at him, watching the way the light danced and shifted. "I decided before I ever met you that I did not want a real husband. I wanted an arrangement, nothing more. Someone who would sign a paper and vanish quietly into the north, leaving me my books and my peace. It was safer that way, I thought. No one to disappoint me, no one to leave, because they were never truly there to begin with. And now..." She turned to look at him. His face was close, closer than she had realized, lit gold by the firelight, his grey eyes steady and searching on hers, all the earlier teasing gone from them now. "Now," she said, "I am beginning to think I signed that contract with entirely the wrong expectations. I expected an empty marriage. I did not expect to find myself wanting a full one. Rachel." Her name, in his voice, sounded different than it ever had before, softer, weighted with something he had clearly not planned to say aloud. His hand came up, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and lingered there, warm against her cheek. "I did not expect to want my own wife this much. It has rather taken me by surprise, if I am honest. I did not expect to let you." They leaned toward each other slowly, the space between them shrinking, the storm outside forgotten entirely, the letters between them on the desk suddenly the least important thing in the room. Rachel's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it over the rain. His breath was warm against her lips, and for one perfect, suspended second, the whole world narrowed down to the two of them, close enough to finally. The ceiling gave way. A great crack sounded overhead, and a full bucket's worth of cold rainwater dropped directly onto Arthur's head, drenching him from crown to collar in an instant, running in rivers down his face and neck. He gasped, sputtering, sitting bolt upright, and Rachel shrieked and toppled backward off the settee in surprise, landing in an undignified heap on the rug, the blanket tangled around her legs. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, Arthur dripping and blinking rainwater from his eyelashes, Rachel sprawled on the floor with her dressing gown askew, both too stunned to speak. Then Arthur began to laugh. It started as a chuckle and grew into a full, helpless roar, water still dripping steadily from his nose, and Rachel, watching him try and utterly fail to look dignified, could not help but join him. They sat there on the study floor, soaked and laughing until her sides ached and tears gathered in the corners of her eyes, the moment of almost romance completely and thoroughly ruined by the worst-timed leak in the entire history of leaking roofs. "I am going to fix that roof," Arthur wheezed, wiping water from his face with the sleeve of his already ruined shirt, "if it is the very last thing I do on this earth." "You said that about the fountain, too, 3 weeks ago. The fountain is a lost cause, and we both know it. The roof I mean it about, entirely." Rachel wiped tears of laughter from her eyes and looked at him, drenched and grinning and utterly unlike any husband she had ever imagined wanting, and found that she did not mind the interruption nearly as much as she probably should have. Whatever moment the storm had stolen from them, it had given her something else in its place, something perhaps even more valuable. The absolute certainty that she did not regret this marriage at all, leaking roof and all. She realized, hopelessly and completely in love with him. 5. Arthur woke the next morning and immediately ruined everything by thinking too much. He lay in bed replaying the night before, the almost kiss, the laughter, the way Rachel had looked at him with something soft and real in her eyes before the ceiling had so rudely interrupted, and somewhere between waking and rising, his mind twisted the whole memory into a disaster of his own making. She was a lady of London, sharp and brilliant and used to fine things, to townhouses with sound roofs and fountains that actually worked. He was a duke with a leaking roof, a stubborn goat, a leaning chimney, and an estate held together with rope, hope, and Mrs. Pruitt's questionable cooking. She had married a stranger by letter expecting quiet and dignity, and instead she had gotten mud, chaos, a soaked husband on the study floor, and a household that could not tell salt from sugar. By the time he reached the breakfast room, he had convinced himself entirely that she deserved better, that a woman like Rachel Vance belonged in a house that did not require a bucket collection strategy every time it rained, and that the noble thing, the only decent thing, was to let her go before she grew to resent him the way he was certain, deep down, she must already be beginning to. He did not tell her this. He simply began packing. Rachel found him an hour later in the courtyard, strapping a bag to his horse with quick, determined movements, his jaw set in the same stubborn line she had already learned, in 3 short weeks, meant trouble. "Where?" she asked, arms crossed, planting herself firmly in the mud between him and his horse. "Do you think you're going?" "London," Arthur said, not meeting her eyes, tightening a buckle that did not particularly need tightening. "I'm taking you back. You should never have been trapped in a contract you signed before you knew what you were truly agreeing to, before you'd seen the state of this place or the man attached to it. I'll have the marriage annulled quietly, through the right channels. No scandal, I promise you that much. You can find someone who actually deserves a wife like you, someone with a house that doesn't leak on his own head during the one moment that mattered." Rachel stared at him, genuinely stunned for a moment by the sheer, stubborn foolishness of what she was hearing. "Arthur Sterling, get down off that horse. Rachel, get down. Now, before I pull you down myself, and I promise you I am entirely capable of it." Something in her voice, some combination of fury and something far softer beneath it, made him obey, more out of habit than agreement. The moment his boots hit the mud, Rachel marched past him into the house without another word and returned less than a minute later holding a folded piece of parchment, slightly yellowed at the edges. Their original marriage contract, the one drawn up by solicitors and signed by 2 people who had never met. She held it up for him to see clearly, and for the gathering handful of servants who had wandered out from the kitchen and stables to watch this latest chapter of chaos unfold, as had become something of a habit at Oakhaven. Then, without a word of warning, she tore it straight down the middle. Arthur's mouth fell open. "What are you doing? That is a legal document, Rachel, you cannot simply." "Ending it," Rachel said, tearing the pieces again for good measure, letting the scraps flutter down into the mud at her feet, where the goat, wandering by on its endless quest for cabbage, immediately began sniffing at them with great interest. That contract was signed by a woman who wanted a ghost for a husband, who wanted an empty house and an empty marriage and nothing more than a title on a piece of paper. "I do not want a ghost anymore, Arthur. I have not wanted that for weeks now, if I am honest, and you know it as well as I do. That contract is void. Rachel, if this is about the roof, or the goat, or the fact that I cannot dance. This is about you deciding, all on your own, in the dead of night apparently, what is best for me without so much as asking my opinion on the matter," Rachel said, stepping close enough through the mud that he had to look at her properly, close enough that the whole watching household went very still and very quiet. I did not fall in love with you so that you could hand me back to London the moment things became slightly difficult, the moment the ceiling leaked at an inconvenient time. I am not fragile, Arthur. I am not some delicate lady who needs saving from her own choices, who cannot be trusted to know her own mind. I chose you, sight unseen, in a letter, weeks ago. I am choosing you again, right now, in the mud, in front of your entire staff and one deeply unimpressed goat. Arthur stared at her, stunned into complete silence, the bag still half-strapped to his horse behind him, entirely forgotten now. Rachel pulled a fresh sheet of parchment and a small traveling quill from the pocket of her dress, where she had, in fact, tucked them that very morning, half expecting she might need them. She held them out to him with a look of absolute, unshakable determination. The old contract was by letter, she said. This one will not be. If you want a Duchess, Arthur Sterling, you are going to court me properly, in person, starting today, starting right now, in this mud. Starting with what, precisely? Starting, Rachel said, tilting her chin up, the mud soaking steadily into the hem of her dress and neither of them caring in the slightest, with a kiss that does not involve a leaking roof, a startled goat, or any interruptions whatsoever. For a moment, Arthur simply looked at her, mud on her hem, torn contract scattered and forgotten at her feet, chin lifted in that stubborn, magnificent way that had undone him from the very first day, when she had handed him a boot and called him a stable hand. Then he laughed, low and warm and entirely unguarded, and closed the last of the distance between them in 2 long strides. He swept her up off her feet entirely, muddy boots and all, ignoring her startled gasp and the scattered, delighted applause that immediately broke out among the watching servants. And there, in the courtyard of Oakhaven Manor, under a grey Yorkshire sky, with a goat bleating somewhere in the distance and a broken fountain trickling quietly nearby, the Duke finally kissed his wife properly. It was nothing like the almost kiss by the fire. There was no storm to interrupt them this time, no ceiling waiting patiently to collapse, no excuse for either of them to pull away before they meant to. It was slow, and thorough, and entirely certain, the kind of kiss that answered every question either of them had been too afraid, or too stubborn, to ask aloud until now. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Rachel pressed her forehead against his and said, "You are still the most chaotic man I have ever met in my entire life." "And you," Arthur said, setting her back gently on her feet, though he did not let go of her hand, "are still the most brilliant, most stubborn woman I have ever had the good fortune to marry twice in 1 week. Twice. Once by letter, 3 weeks ago, to a stranger. Once properly, right here, right now, in the mud, to a woman I happen to love rather desperately." Rachel smiled, the kind of smile she had not allowed herself in years, wide and unguarded and entirely happy, the sort of smile that had nothing to do with careful composure and everything to do with the strange, muddy, chaotic life she had somehow found herself living. Somewhere behind them, Mrs. Pruitt was crying happy tears into her apron, already whispering to the footman about how she must tell the whole village by supper. The goat had wandered over to nose curiously at the torn scraps of the old marriage contract scattered in the mud, as if even the animals of Oakhaven understood, in their own way, that something important had just changed for good. She had come to Yorkshire expecting a quiet, empty marriage to a man she would never have to see, a contract signed and forgotten, a life lived entirely alone by choice. She had found instead a chaotic estate, a leaking roof, a stubborn goat, a fountain that would likely never work again, and a husband who made her laugh until her sides ached and who had loved her mind, her handwriting, her terrible opinions about hunting, long before he had ever loved her face. She did not regret it. Not one single moment of it, mud and all. She was, at last, exactly where she was meant to be.